I'm Terry Lohman. I'm the co-chair of UU's for Just Economic Community. Just Economic Community. And I'm in Ames, Iowa right now. Okay, and Jared's in New York. And he works for New York's Civil Liberties Union, their version of ACLU. And he went to Iowa State University for his undergrad work and then went on. You went to Yale, right?
No, for law school, I went to Hofstra.
Pardon?
Hofstra for law school.
Hofstra.
And he worked for me a long time ago and was just super professional. Really impressed with him. And his topic tonight is reducing poverty through sentencing reform. And this should be really interesting to us because we're economic justice people and racial justice people. So I don't think we should keep you, Jared. Go ahead and start. And if people want to see the first part of it, they can check it out in the recording.
Well, great. And first off, Terry, thank you so much for inviting me on to speak about this issue. It's something that's really near and dear to my heart. As Terry said, I'm Jared Trujillo. My current role is I'm Senior Policy Counsel at the ACLU of New York, NYCLU. Before that, I led the Public Defender Union out here in New York. And way before that, I worked at the ACLU of Iowa, and I worked for Terry. So it's great to see a familiar face and to share this space with you all tonight. The topic I'm going to talk to you about, so I'll talk at you for about 15 minutes or so, but please, if at any point you want to stop me for clarity, please do so. And then I'll of course leave a lot of time open for questions. But the topic I'll speak to you about tonight is reducing multi-generational poverty through sentencing reform. I'm actually really excited to have this conversation with this group because of your focus on racial justice and your focus on criminal legal system reform. Now, something that Audre Lorde used to always say is that we don't live single issue lives. And that was to say that someone who is impacted by the criminal legal system, might have been impacted by the foster care system, is probably impacted by the shelter system, is probably impacted by all the different means of surveillance that we have that impact low-income folks. And so one of the purposes of this research and of the very real bills that we work on in New York, but also in other jurisdictions that are really meant to alleviate the poverty that is associated with long prison sentences. All these systems are certainly interrelated. So very excited to speak to this group. So why do we have why are prison sentences as long as they are in the United States? When prisons were first really instituted in the United States, they were really thought of as being rehabilitative institutions. Now, whether they actually provided rehabilitation or not, that's certainly debatable. I would say they didn't, but the purpose of them really was to provide rehabilitation. After the advent of the civil rights movement and massive victories for Black rights, for women, for LGBTQ folks in the 60s and early 70s, what happened? The drug war. This year, we're celebrating the 50-year anniversary of the drug war. And specifically in New York, the passage of the Rockefeller drug laws that sentenced people to really long, harsh sentences for sometimes selling, but oftentimes for mere possession. With the advent of the Rockefeller drug laws, New York, which was first, but then certainly every other jurisdiction in the United States, people could serve life sentences for substance use offenses. And this was by design. We know from Richard Nixon, one of the targets of the drug war were Black and brown folks, were quote unquote hippies, were so many of the other folks that the Nixon administration found to be repugnant. And the very real target, the people that actually were impacted by the drug war, were Black and brown folks, were low income folks, were people that were living at the margins. And through the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, as prisons became fuller, because people were going to prison for more offenses, but also because people were spending longer time in prison. As prisons got more full, the investments to low-income communities also diminished. We were effectively we're taking the community resources for low-income kids, for school luncheons, for community safety from low-income communities, and trafficking that money into prisons. And that happened through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, which was really accompanied by a lot of tough on crime legislation. And that really went on through the early 2000s. Even though the idea of increasing prison sentences was supposed to enhance public safety, no one really had any evidence to suggest that it would. And in fact, pretty early on, most of the research suggested that increasing prison sentences did not actually increase public safety. Why is that? A lot of the people that we were incarcerating were young folks. And if you take a young person who is ultimately going to be back into the community and you put them into a prison that is a dangerous place, a prison that through the 70s and 80s and 90s, we also reduced the amount of programming that we had for people that were incarcerated. And if you put people in that environment and you expect them to be better when they leave, that's ridiculous. Prisons are dangerous, prisons are traumatic, and prisons actually reinforce the bad and negative and antisocial habits that lead people to being in them in the first place. And half a century after the passage of the Rockefeller drug laws, what do we have? Just incredibly high prison sentences. And these prison sentences don't just impact the individual, but they impact their entire families. So what is the link between multi-generational poverty and long prison sentences look like? Well, we know that an individual that serves a long prison sentence, their lifelong income is likely to be reduced by about 52%. And that's someone who serves in an adult prison. Even someone who serves in a juvenile facility, their lifetime earnings are reduced by about $5 to $6 an hour for the rest of their lives. And when you incarcerate someone, you don't just incarcerate that individual, but you're really incarcerating their entire family. You know, in both big cities, like New York or Chicago, but also in small towns as well, it is oftentimes really difficult and really expensive for a family to maintain contact with an incarcerated loved one. So oftentimes families will forego maybe starting a business, maybe investing more in their children's education, maybe taking a vacation, maybe doing just so many of the things that families need to do in order to be able to be economically mobile. And they will route all that money into caring for that incarcerated loved one, plus court fees, which is a much longer conversation. But court fees typically are around $13,000 for a lot of felonies, depending on the state. And so you have that, plus you have the real impact of having an incarcerated parent. And in having an incarcerated parent, it's not just a parent who is traveling for work. It's not a parent who maybe lives in a different town that you don't see for a long time, but it is a parent that you know as a child is living in a really traumatic environment. It is a parent who you don't have the love from, the Christmases or Hanukkahs with, the day-to-day ability to talk to them about homework, the real love that people get from parents, which is so important. When a parent is incarcerated, someone is deprived of that. And I just remind everyone, again, that long prison sentences don't actually make us safer. They're not really a deterrent from crime. So what you're actually doing is you're incarcerating an individual, you're traumatizing their offspring. And kids that have an incarcerated parent are about 6 times more likely to be incarcerated themselves. Not because criminality is genetic, but because of the real financial impact of having an incarcerated parent and the emotional impact of having an incarcerated parent. And because incarceration in the United States is really concentrated in low income communities and Black and brown communities, The result has been, following the Rockefeller drug laws and the really harsh sentencing laws that follow them in all 50 states, is that you have multi-generational cycles of poverty, incarceration, reincarceration, further poverty, and reincarceration. And that affects individuals, that affects families, and that affects entire communities, where entire communities have been devastated because of the current system. Kirk, I saw you come off mute. Did you have a question?
No, I thought that I wasn't on mute, and I wanted to.
Right.
Sorry.
No worries. Sorry about that. All right. So, so we know that long prison sentences don't actually increase public safety, but what does actually increase public safety? And when we think about that, we actually have to look at the root causes as to why people end up incarcerated in the first place. And we have to address those root causes, and we have to address them in ways that don't further traumatize people, but actually make people better off, actually give people the skills that they need to make different choices than the ones that ultimately led them to be incarcerated in the first place. And so in New York and many other jurisdictions, in the 90s, with the advent of truth in sentencing laws, which were laws that increased the federal government incentivized states to do truth in sentencing laws, where sentences were increased and people's opportunities to earn time off their sentences for doing vocational programming, or job training, or treatment, or drug rehab, or just many other things. Effectively, the money for those programs dried up. We know that if we actually want to increase community safety, we need to give people access to those programs. So instead of investing in incarcerating people for longer, we need to invest in programs that will give people skills that they need to survive on the outside, but then also give them the incentive to do those programs by saying, if you do this, we can reduce your sentence. And the states that provide the most generous programming for those different programs, the states that are the most generous in providing those programs are not the ones that you think. I live in New York, which people think of as a really blue bubble. And one of our bills right now is to try to get us to be as progressive as Oklahoma and Texas, as far as the provision of those programs. And so Iowa, from what I've seen, is somewhere in the middle. But even the best states in this really have a lot of room to improve as far as providing people programming and really recognizing that the people that are incarcerated are our neighbors, will be our neighbors, and treating people as humans, and recognizing that they have families is ultimately the way that we reduce crime and we create real community safety. So the bills, I wrote a law review article on this. There are 5 bills in particular that we proposed for New York that would actually give us a better system. But beyond New York's bills, there's a really basic structural framework for what bills and what legislative solutions look like to remedy the issue that we have now. One, we have to attack things at the front end. And so to prevent people from serving long sentences, unduly harsh sentences in the first place. And that starts with looking at the juvenile justice system. The United States is just so far behind everywhere else in the world as far as treating kids like kids. A lot of that is because of the kids that end up in the juvenile carceral system are Black and brown. And we know that Black and brown kids tend to get more adultified, younger, tend to be thought of as less redeemable, tend to be thought of as less savable, less worth investing in. And we just need to change that as a society. We need to ensure that kids are not getting permanent records. One, because it hurts that, and one, it just doesn't make sense. We know that people, and I hate this term, but tend to age out of criminality by about 25. Most research says that the prefrontal cortex in people's brains, which influences impulse control, is really developing until people's 25th birthday. And so someone is very different at 22 years old than they are, at 30, at 35, or at 40. And giving someone the scarlet letter and the albatross of a criminal conviction early on impacts their ability to get housing, to get healthcare, to send their kids to a good school, to start a business, or even to get a job. And those impacts compound so that oftentimes feel that someone, like, I used to be a juvenile defense attorney. My 17-year-old clients often would feel that, well, I have this on me, so what's the point of doing the summer youth employment program? What's the point of doing all this stuff because I'm just a felon forever? And we need to really think about those labels that we put onto people, and particularly for young people, create alternatives to incarceration, but also alternatives to the scarlet mark of a criminal conviction to follow them their entire lives. Second, we really need to look at what mandatory minimum sentences look like. The real culprit for mass incarceration in the United States today are mandatory minimum sentences, which are sentences that judges are required to impose just based upon the offense. And the reality of mandatory minimum sentences is that prosecutors will often weaponize them to coerce stricter pleas. So, you know, if in a typical case, a prosecutor has a range of different charging options, a prosecutor might charge someone with an offense that is probably a higher level offense than their conduct really justifies in order to effectively force that person into taking a plea. Because if that person doesn't take a plea, then the person faces a lot more jail time, a lot more prison time, I'm sorry. And that could be really scary for people. When I was a public defense attorney, I had so many clients that really wanted to fight their cases and really wanted to go to trial and really asserted their innocence. And some of them have actually been exonerated, but they weren't effectively able to because there was that fear of that mandatory minimum of being away from their wives, from their husbands, from their siblings, from their children for, say, 8 years instead of 3 years. Secondly, we have to look at the people that are, we have to look at the people that are already incarcerated and think about what do we do for the people that are already serving these long sentences? And a big component is to look at resentencing, to let people go in front of a judge and say, hey, this is who I was when you sentenced me. This is what we know about the world now, what we know about long sentences. And also, this is what I've done while incarcerated, and give judges the opportunity to go back and determine whether a person should serve a shorter sentence. Does that mean that everyone is going to get released today? No, but it at least gives people, one, the opportunity, but also the carrot to improve themselves so that they might be released sooner, so that they can be a resource for their families and for their community sooner. And then finally, the big piece that we need to really be meaningfully investing in, whether it be New York or Iowa or Florida or anywhere, is meaningful programming for people that are incarcerated. Programming that gives people the skills that they will need to survive once they leave their carceral facilities. And so, what can you do to make this a reality? Something that I teach, in addition to the night clue, I teach second-year law students and first-year law students at City University of New York. And something that I noticed in teaching is that so many of my students, so these are people that went to law school, whether it's because, I mean, for me, I watched Matlock with my grandma and I'm like, this looks amazing, I want to do that job. But, you know, people go to law school for a lot of different reasons, typically because they want to impact the system. But even those people that really are invested in systematic change don't really know how the criminal legal system operates. So an important thing that you can do is just to tell people how the criminal legal system operates. You know, New York, we're having a really big debate around bail, and so when I talk about these bills, it's really hard to get the attention of legislators. And, you know, just for people to know that this is different than bail. And, you know, these are the different aspects of the criminal legal system. Those things are really important for people to know. You can talk to your legislators. You know, this is a part of my job that I personally hate is the lobbying part, but it's a necessary evil, unfortunately. To get legislative change, you have to get people to make the laws, to make different ones. And you have to get your respective governors in whatever state you're in to sign them. So being on the lookout for campaigns that are really geared towards making the criminal legal system more equitable, whether that be with your church groups or whoever, engaging in those, and then just calling your legislators. One of the reasons why our criminal legal system is so antiquated is because a lot of the people that are impacted by it, well, one, can't vote because of felon disenfranchisement, but oftentimes are thought of as disposable. and people think that, and people just aren't as invested in the criminal legal system as they should be for a country that incarcerates so many people. Letting your legislators know that you care and that you're watching what they do goes a really long way. Showing solidarity with incarcerated people, whether that be letter writing campaigns or whatever. Knowing that someone has your back and values your humanity, especially when you're living in a system that definitely doesn't, it does so much for your spirit. And I could talk to you about the bills I work on all day, but the people that are incarcerated are, I mean, they're really doing the work. And you know, I go back to my tiny New York apartment at the end of the day and they go to a cell. And so like keeping them inspired to do that work is so important. And then the final piece, and then I'll stop ranting at you all, is, you know, whatever you are doing to really uplift low income people, whether it be working on homelessness issues or children's issues or whatever you're doing, it does impact this. You know, doing criminal legal system reform work is not for everyone. It's not where everyone's interests lie, but all these systems really interconnect. A kid who ends up in prison at 21 years old, probably the first time that they were failed was not the first time that they, you know, did or were accused of doing whatever conduct led them to be incarcerated in the first place. So really working on all those systems that interconnect the school system, foster care, literally everything, and really focusing on uplifting people, particularly low-income folks. These are all things that, one, make people's lives better, and two, make it so that help create the framework so that we can have less inequitable laws that govern our criminal legal system. And I've talked at you for a little bit over 20 minutes now. Happy to take any questions or explain anything further. Yeah, thank you all so much for your time. I left my CUNY email and my ACLU email in the chat. Please email me and double email me if I don't see it. I'm never ignoring you. I just might not see it. You know, for any citations that you want, they're all in my law review article, but if you don't want to sift through 40 pages, I get it. My partner hasn't read it yet either. And so just let me know what you're looking for and I can find it for you so you don't have to go through all of it. And seriously, thank you all for hearing me rant, and thank you all so much for what you do. And Terry, thank you for being so wonderful to me for the past decade.
Sweet.
You've earned it. Well, thank you, everybody. Now we can go back. You know, there were 16 people on Facebook. For some reason or other, everybody joined on Facebook. Bye.